Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself that the best revenge is not to become like the person who wronged you. That single idea changes everything. Because when you stop trying to fix other people and start managing the way you respond to them, the entire dynamic begins to transform. In this episode, we're going to explore 10 Stoic principles that quietly change how toxic people interact with you, not through aggression, not through dramatic confrontations, but through something much more powerful: clarity, self-control, and the refusal to participate in the games that fuel disrespect. And the strange thing is, when you apply even one of these shifts consistently, people who once ignored your boundaries often begin to treat you very differently. Not because they suddenly became better people, but because the environment that allowed them to disrespect you no longer exists. So let's begin with the first and most important shift. Number 1. The day you stop explaining yourself is the day respect begins. Most people believe that respect is something you earn through communication, so when someone crosses a line, their first instinct is to explain. They explain what bothered them. They explain why the comment felt disrespectful. They explain their intentions so the other person doesn't misunderstand them. In their mind, this is the mature thing to do. It feels reasonable, calm, emotionally intelligent. But something very different is happening beneath the surface. Because toxic people are not listening to your explanations the way healthy people do. They are not listening to understand your boundary. They are listening to measure it. Every time you explain the same boundary again, you unintentionally reveal something important. You reveal that the boundary is negotiable. You reveal that it can be pushed, questioned, debated, and softened. And once someone realizes that your limits can be negotiated through pressure or persistence, they begin to test them more often. At first, the tests are small: a sarcastic comment disguised as humor, a subtle interruption when you're speaking, a dismissive tone when you share an opinion. Nothing dramatic enough to justify a big reaction. And because it feels small, you try to handle it calmly. You explain, "I didn't like that comment. I just want you to respect that boundary. I'm not comfortable with that." But with the wrong person, explanations do not create respect. They create information. They show how much emotional effort you are willing to invest just to keep the interaction peaceful. They show how uncomfortable you are with confrontation. And slowly, the dynamic changes. The person is no longer wondering whether they can cross the line. They are simply discovering how far the line moves when they push. The Stoics understood something that many people today forget. Dignity is not defended through constant justification. It is protected through quiet clarity. Epictetus once said that if someone truly has the power to insult you, it is because you have accepted their judgment as meaningful. The moment you stop treating their opinion as something that needs negotiation, the insult loses its weight. And that is the real shift. Respect often begins the day you stop explaining yourself to people who have already shown they are not interested in understanding. Not because you become cold, not because you become aggressive, but because you stop performing emotional labor for someone who is simply measuring your tolerance. Instead of long explanations, the boundary becomes simple and visible through behavior. You disengage from the conversation. You redirect your attention. You respond briefly and move on. No speech, no debate, no emotional defense. Something interesting happens when you do this consistently. People who once pushed your boundaries suddenly lose the feedback they relied on. They no longer get the explanations, the emotional reactions, the negotiations that once made the interaction predictable. And unpredictability is something toxic personalities deeply dislike. Because manipulation only works when the response is predictable. When the explanation disappears, the dynamic begins to change. And often, without you saying a single dramatic word, the person who once tested your boundaries starts to behave differently around you. Not because you forced them to respect you, but because the environment that allowed them to disrespect you quietly disappeared. Number 2. Disrespect is a quiet experiment. One of the biggest mistakes people make when dealing with toxic behavior is assuming that disrespect is accidental. They tell themselves the other person didn't mean it that way. They convince themselves that maybe the joke was harmless, maybe the comment was misunderstood, maybe the interruption was just bad timing, and because they give the benefit of the doubt again and again, they miss what is actually happening. Because in many toxic dynamics, disrespect is not random, it is experimental. Think about how subtle it usually begins. Someone interrupts you once while you're speaking, then it happens again a few days later. A sarcastic joke about you appears in a group conversation, but it's disguised with laughter so no one feels comfortable calling it out. Someone dismisses your opinion quickly, then moves on before you can fully respond. None of these moments are dramatic enough to create a scene, but taken together, they form a pattern. And patterns are rarely accidental. People who operate this way are often observing far more than they are speaking. They are watching your reactions carefully. They are noticing whether you laugh it off, whether you explain yourself, whether you try to smooth the moment over so things don't become uncomfortable. Every reaction you give teaches them something about the limits of your tolerance. This is why disrespect often grows slowly. It doesn't begin with something extreme. It begins with something small enough that you question your own perception. Was that really disrespectful? Am I overreacting? Should I just ignore it? By the time the behavior becomes obvious, the pattern has already been established. The Stoics had a very clear way of understanding this. They believed that most conflicts between people are not about the event itself, but about the judgments that follow it. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself to observe behavior objectively before reacting emotionally. Instead of immediately assuming intention, he trained himself to watch patterns. And that same discipline becomes incredibly powerful in these situations. The moment you begin looking at behavior as a pattern rather than as isolated moments, things become clearer. The repeated interruptions are no longer random. The jokes at your expense are no longer harmless humor. The dismissive tone is no longer a misunderstanding. It is a method. Not always conscious, not always malicious in the dramatic sense, but still a method. Because in social dynamics, people naturally test the environment around them. They test what is tolerated and what is not, and the environment is defined by the reactions it produces. If someone pushes a boundary and nothing happens, that boundary becomes weaker. If someone pushes again and receives emotional explanations instead of consequences, the boundary becomes even softer. Eventually, the person learns that crossing the line has very little cost. And once a behavior becomes costless, it becomes normal. This is why recognizing the experimental nature of disrespect is so important. It removes the confusion. Instead of asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" you begin asking a much more useful question. What are they learning from my reactions? That single shift changes your position completely. You are no longer the confused participant in the interaction. You become the observer of the dynamic itself. And observation creates distance, and distance creates clarity. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you also see something else. You see exactly where the pattern can be interrupted. And that interruption begins with the next shift. Number 3. The first real shift. Stop being the target. Start being the observer. Here's where everything changes, and it doesn't change because you suddenly become tougher, or louder, or more confrontational. It changes because you stop living inside the emotional role they assigned you, and you step outside the scene long enough to watch it. Toxic people are experts at turning you into a character in their story. They push, they provoke, they poke, and then they wait for you to play your part. The defensive one, the apologetic one, the over-explainer. The one who gets angry, loses composure, then regrets it later. They don't need you to be weak, they just need you to be predictable. And the moment you shift from reaction to observation, predictability dies. Most people experience toxic disrespect like this. Something happens, and immediately the body reacts. Your chest tightens. Your mind races. You want to defend yourself, correct the narrative, prove you're not what they implied. You start thinking of the perfect response, the perfect sentence, the perfect explanation that will make them finally treat you fairly. But that is exactly the trap, because while your mind is busy trying to fix the moment, they're learning how to control you. The Stoics had a different discipline. They trained themselves to create space between stimulus and response, not because they were passive, but because they were strategic. Marcus Aurelius wrote again and again about the importance of seeing things as they are, not as the ego instantly interprets them. He wasn't trying to win arguments. He was trying to keep his inner world sovereign. So instead of asking, why are they doing this, you ask a colder question, what are they trying to get? And once you ask that, everything becomes clearer. If they interrupt you, what are they gaining? Control of the conversation, authority, the feeling that your voice is optional. If they joke about you in public, what are they gaining? Social dominance, a laugh at your expense, a way to lower you without looking openly hostile. If they dismiss your opinion, what are they gaining? A quiet message. You don't matter here. When you see it this way, the emotional fog lifts. You stop taking it personally in the way they want you to. You stop feeling confused. You stop thinking you need to earn basic respect through perfect communication. And here's the hidden power of observation. It makes you harder to manipulate because you are no longer absorbed in the drama. You become the one watching the pattern, not the one being swallowed by it. And once you are observing, you begin noticing something you never saw before. The timing, the repetition, the trigger points, the same tone they use, the same moment they choose, the same audience they prefer. You start seeing that it's not about you being too sensitive or too serious. It's about them using the same tools because those tools worked before. Observation turns you from a participant into a judge. Not the judge in the emotional sense, not someone sitting in bitterness, but the judge in the Stoic sense. Someone who evaluates what is happening with clarity and chooses how to respond based on principle, not impulse. And this is exactly why toxic people hate calm, observant individuals. Because calm observation removes their favorite weapon, emotional control. If you can't be provoked, you can't be steered. If you don't rush to defend yourself, they lose the pleasure of watching you scramble. If you don't explain, they don't get to debate you. And once you become the observer, you start doing something else, something even more threatening to them. You start removing the fuel. That takes us to the next point. Number 4. Emotional reactions are the fuel of manipulation. Toxic dynamics don't survive on logic. They survive on energy. And the easiest energy to extract from a person is emotional energy, especially the kind that makes you rush, explain, defend, or lose your calm. This is why, when you look back on certain interactions, you realize something strange. The event itself wasn't that big, but the emotional aftermath was exhausting. Your mind replayed the conversation for hours. You imagined better responses. You felt angry, embarrassed, or guilty. You wondered if you were overreacting. You felt the need to clear the air. And sometimes you even sent that long message you knew you shouldn't send, trying to be understood by someone who never intended to understand you. That emotional spiral is not an accident. It is the system working exactly as designed. Because toxic people don't always need to win the conversation, they just need you emotionally hooked. The moment you're hooked, they can pull you into arguments, guilt, justifications, and endless back and forth. And every time you participate, they gain something: attention, control, a sense of power, and often the ability to rewrite the story so you end up feeling like the problem. This is why the most dangerous trap is not disrespect itself. It's your reaction to it. The Stoics were obsessed with one idea: your inner state is your true territory. Everything else, other people's behavior, their words, their mood, belongs to the external world. And the external world is not yours to control, but your response is yours. That is where your power lives. Epictetus broke it down with brutal clarity. People are not disturbed by things, but by the view they take of things. Meaning, the event is one thing, your interpretation is another, and your reaction is what determines whether the event becomes poison inside you. Toxic people understand this, even if they understand it instinctively rather than intellectually. They know that if they can provoke you, they can control the rhythm of the interaction. If they can make you angry, they can make you loud. If they can make you defensive, they can make you explain. If they can make you guilty, they can make you chase their approval. That's why certain people push the exact buttons that produce the biggest reactions, and they often do it with plausible deniability. They say something disrespectful, then hide behind, "I was joking." They cross a line, then act offended when you address it. They use tone, timing, and subtle disrespect, because subtle disrespect creates confusion, and confusion creates emotional reactions. And emotional reactions are predictable. Predictability is the lifeblood of manipulation. Here's the shift. You don't need to destroy them. You don't need to expose them. You don't need to fight for dominance. You simply need to stop feeding the system. Because when the reaction disappears, the dynamic weakens. Not immediately and not without resistance, but it weakens. When you don't argue, they lose the stage. When you don't explain, they lose the leverage. When you don't get emotional, they lose the fuel. And when toxic people lose the fuel, they start showing their true intentions more clearly. They either escalate to get the reaction back, or they retreat because the game is no longer rewarding. This is why calm is not a personality trait. Calm is a boundary. It is you saying, without words, you don't get access to my nervous system. And once you understand that, the next step becomes obvious. You don't just stay calm as a nice idea. You create a deliberate distance, a kind of controlled detachment that becomes your first real line of defense. That takes us to the next point. Number 5. Calm detachment is the first true boundary. Most people think a boundary is something you say, a sentence, a warning, a clear statement like, "Don't speak to me like that," or "I'm not okay with this." And yes, sometimes words are necessary. But in toxic dynamics, words alone often become part of the game because words invite debate, negotiation, emotional discussion, and that's exactly the arena where toxic people feel powerful. A real boundary is not a speech. A real boundary is a change in access, and the first form of that change is calm detachment. Detachment doesn't mean you become cold. It doesn't mean you pretend you don't care when you do. It means you stop letting your emotions become publicly accessible to someone who uses them as a lever. You stop offering your inner world as something they can step into, rearrange, and weaponize. This is why calm detachment is so threatening to toxic people, because it creates distance, and distance makes you hard to control. When you respond calmly, slowly, without emotional urgency, you introduce something they dislike more than confrontation: uncertainty. They don't know what you're feeling. They don't know what you're planning. They don't know how far they can push. And because they can't read you clearly, they lose the ability to steer you. A toxic person often depends on the emotional rhythm of the interaction. They say something sharp, you react. They dismiss you, you explain. They provoke you, you defend. There's a predictable sequence. But when you become calmly detached, that sequence breaks. And that break is the boundary. Stoicism teaches this at its core. The Stoics didn't try to appear unbothered for image. They practiced inner discipline because they believed a person who cannot be emotionally controlled cannot be truly defeated. Marcus Aurelius wasn't saying, "Ignore people," in a naive way. He was training himself to keep his mind stable no matter what others tried to pull him into. So calm detachment is not avoidance, it is sovereignty. It's you saying, "I will not give you immediate emotional access to me." And practically, this shows up in simple ways. You pause before responding. You don't rush to correct their tone. You don't hurry to defend your character. You reduce your words. You keep your face calm. You let silence exist. And this is important. Silence is not weakness here. Silence is a refusal to play. Most people fear silence because they think it makes them look guilty or powerless. But in toxic dynamics, the person who rushes to speak is usually the one trying to regain control emotionally. The person who can remain calm, measured, and unhurried is the one who controls the tempo. And tempo is power. When you create calm detachment, you stop arguing your boundary into existence. You start living it. You stop performing emotional availability for someone who disrespects you. You stop negotiating your dignity. You stop working hard to be understood by someone who enjoys misunderstanding you. Now, here's the key truth. The moment you begin practicing calm detachment, you should expect a reaction. Because toxic people don't like when the environment changes. They were comfortable when you were predictable, when you explained, when you got emotional, when you were available. But when you detach calmly, the pattern that fed them begins to collapse. And when a pattern collapses, it often tries to rebuild itself aggressively. Which is exactly why the next point matters so much. Number 6. Expect resistance. When the pattern breaks. The moment you change your behavior in a toxic dynamic, something almost always happens that surprises people. Instead of the situation immediately calming down, it often becomes worse for a short period of time. The jokes become sharper. The tone becomes colder. The criticism becomes louder. The person suddenly accuses you of being different, distant, or difficult. Many people interpret this moment as proof that their new approach is failing. They think, maybe I should go back to explaining myself. Maybe I should smooth things over again. But in reality, what you are witnessing is something very predictable. You are witnessing resistance. When someone has grown used to controlling the emotional dynamic between you, your calm detachment disrupts the system they relied on. The pattern that once worked suddenly stops producing the results they expected. And when a pattern stops working, the first instinct is not to abandon it. The first instinct is to push harder. Psychologists call this an extinction burst. It happens when a behavior that used to produce a reward suddenly stops working. For a short time, the person intensifies the behavior in an attempt to get the reward back. Imagine someone pressing a button that used to turn on a light. If the light stops responding, they don't immediately walk away. They press the button again, harder, faster, several times. Only when it continues to fail do they eventually stop. The same thing happens in toxic dynamics. When the emotional reaction disappears, the person may escalate their behavior in an attempt to bring it back. They might provoke you more aggressively. They might try guilt. They might try to paint you as the problem. They might even attempt to pull others into the situation so they can restore the old dynamic. This is the moment where many people lose their progress. Because escalation feels uncomfortable. It creates tension. It makes you want to fix the atmosphere again. But the Stoic approach teaches something different. Discomfort is often the signal that the old pattern is dying. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this kind of moment frequently. He reminded himself that when people behave poorly, it is not because they suddenly changed their nature, but because they are following habits and beliefs they have always carried. Your task is not to correct their nature. Your task is to maintain your own. And maintaining your own means staying consistent. You do not need to argue with the escalation. You do not need to defend yourself against every accusation. You do not need to prove your calmness to anyone. You simply remain steady. When the push becomes stronger, you remain the same. When the tone becomes louder, your tone remains quiet. When the attempts to provoke increase, your reactions remain minimal. Consistency is what eventually breaks the pattern, because manipulation only survives when the response can be changed. If the response remains stable, calm, detached, predictable in its composure, but unpredictable in its lack of emotion, the person eventually learns something new. They learn that the old strategy no longer works. And once a strategy stops producing results, people naturally begin looking elsewhere for attention, for control, or for emotional reactions. This is why patience matters in this phase. You are not trying to win the interaction. You are allowing the old system to collapse under its own weight. And when it does, the dynamic that once allowed disrespect slowly disappears. But calm detachment alone is not enough. The way you communicate also changes. You stop using emotional language that invites debate, and you replace it with something much simpler. That leads to the next principle. Number 7. Replace emotional language with clear facts. One of the most powerful changes you can make in toxic interactions is surprisingly simple. You stop speaking the language of emotion, and you begin speaking the language of facts. Most people don't realize how much emotional language invites manipulation. When someone disrespects you, the instinct is to explain how it made you feel. You say things like, "That really hurt me," or "I feel disrespected when you talk like that," or "You're making me uncomfortable." These statements are honest, and in healthy relationships, they can open the door to understanding. But with toxic individuals, emotional language often becomes an opening for argument. They don't respond to the behavior you described. Instead, they attack the emotion behind it. They say you're overreacting. They say you're too sensitive. They twist the conversation until the focus is no longer on what they did, but on whether your feelings are justified. And suddenly you find yourself defending your emotions instead of addressing their behavior. This is where clarity becomes powerful. Instead of emotional explanations, your communication becomes simple and factual. You describe what happened without turning it into a debate about feelings, not with anger, not with sarcasm, just calm observation. For example, instead of saying, "You embarrassed me with that joke," you might say, "That comment wasn't appropriate." Instead of saying, "You never listened to me," you say, "You interrupted me twice while I was speaking." Instead of arguing about intention, you describe the action itself. Facts are difficult to manipulate because they leave less space for emotional distortion. A toxic person may still try to argue, but the conversation becomes shorter. There is no emotional speech to dissect, no long explanation to twist, just a clear statement about behavior. And here is the deeper reason this works. Emotional language invites the other person into your inner world. Facts keep the interaction at the level of behavior. When you stay at that level, the conversation becomes less about drama and more about reality. The Stoics practiced this kind of clarity constantly. Marcus Aurelius often wrote reminders to himself to see things as they are. He would strip events down to their simplest description so his mind wouldn't be overwhelmed by emotion or interpretation. Instead of saying, "This person insulted me and ruined my day," he would reduce it to something much simpler. A person spoke words. That reduction created distance between the event and his reaction, and distance created control. The same principle works in modern interactions. When you remove emotional complexity from your responses, you also remove the fuel that keeps manipulative conversations alive. You are not ignoring what happened. You are not suppressing your emotions. You are simply refusing to turn your emotions into a stage for someone who thrives on drama. And once the emotional theater disappears, something else begins to surface. Clarity. Clarity about the behavior. Clarity about the pattern. And most importantly, clarity about the next realization many people struggle to accept. Because sometimes the problem is not that the other person doesn't understand your boundaries. Sometimes the problem is that they understand them perfectly and simply don't care. That realization leads to the next and perhaps most difficult step. Number 8. The moment you stop hoping they will change. There is a quiet trap that keeps many people stuck in toxic dynamics much longer than they should be, and it does not look like weakness. In fact, it often looks like compassion. It is hope. Hope that the person will eventually understand. Hope that if you explain one more time, they will finally see your perspective. Hope that if you stay patient long enough, their behavior will soften. And hope can feel noble. It feels kind. It feels forgiving. But in the wrong situation, hope becomes something very different. It becomes the thread that keeps you tied to the same pattern. Because when someone repeatedly shows you the same behavior, what you are witnessing is not confusion. It is consistency. A person who interrupts you once may not notice. A person who interrupts you every time you speak has made a choice. A person who makes a careless comment once might regret it. A person who repeatedly humiliates you in subtle ways knows exactly what they are doing. The painful truth is that some people are not struggling to understand your boundaries. They understand them perfectly. They simply do not value them. And the longer you hold on to hope that they will suddenly become a different version of themselves, the longer you remain emotionally invested in fixing something that was never yours to fix. The Stoics were deeply realistic about human nature. They did not expect people to suddenly transform because someone wished it. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that people act according to their character, their habits, and their understanding of the world. In other words, people tend to repeat who they already are. This realization is not meant to make you cynical. It is meant to make you clear. When you stop hoping someone will change, something powerful happens. Your attention shifts away from them and returns to you. Instead of asking, "How do I make them respect me?" you begin asking a different question. Why am I still investing energy in someone who has already shown me their pattern? And this question is liberating, because the moment hope disappears, the emotional negotiation ends. You are no longer waiting for their transformation. You are no longer explaining your boundaries in hopes of a breakthrough. You are simply adjusting your behavior based on what you have already observed. You create distance. You limit access. You stop offering emotional availability where it is not respected. This shift is quiet, but it changes everything. The person who once had constant access to your time, your patience, and your emotional energy suddenly notices something different. You are no longer chasing understanding. You are no longer trying to repair every uncomfortable interaction. You are simply less available. And when access becomes limited, the dynamic begins to rebalance. Because respect is closely tied to value, and value increases when something is no longer freely available to everyone. This is why the next step is so important. Once you stop hoping for change, you begin practicing something much more powerful. You become selective with your energy. Number 9. Selective energy is the ultimate boundary. Once you stop explaining, stop reacting, stop hoping, and start seeing the pattern clearly, you reach a point where the boundary is no longer a statement. It becomes a lifestyle. You become selective. And this is where your power becomes unmistakable, because selective energy is the kind of boundary toxic people can't argue with. They can debate your words, twist your tone, and accuse you of being too sensitive, but they cannot debate access. They cannot manipulate what they can no longer reach. Most people think respect is something you demand, but in reality, respect often grows when your attention becomes valuable. If your time is always available, people treat it like it's cheap. If your warmth is given too freely, people treat it like it's unlimited. If your emotional investment never changes, even after disrespect, people learn that crossing the line doesn't really cost them anything. So the ultimate boundary is not anger, it is scarcity. Not artificial scarcity, not games, not pretending to be busy, but real scarcity, the kind that comes from self-respect, the kind that says, my energy is not an open resource. This is deeply Stoic, because the Stoics believed your attention is one of the few things truly under your control. Where you direct it shapes your life. And if you constantly direct it toward people who drain, disrespect, and manipulate, you are actively building a life around their chaos. Selective energy means you start making quiet choices. You stop responding instantly. You stop staying in conversations that feel degrading. You stop overgiving to people who under-respect. You stop offering vulnerability to someone who uses it as ammunition. And the difference is not dramatic, it's surgical. You don't announce it, you don't threaten, you don't lecture. You simply shift the way you participate. You show up differently, and people feel it. This is important. Toxic people often don't fear conflict. They fear losing access. Conflict can be used. It can be provoked, dramatized, and manipulated. But loss of access is final. Loss of access removes the game. And once you become selective, something interesting happens. The disrespect often reduces on its own, because the environment that rewarded disrespect no longer exists. When someone realizes that disrespect means they get less of you, less attention, less warmth, less reaction, less access, the incentive disappears. They may still be who they are, but they stop trying certain moves because the reward is gone. This is not about punishing them, it's about aligning reality with your standards. Because a boundary without consequence is just a request. But consequence doesn't always mean confrontation. Consequence can mean distance. It can mean silence. It can mean you stop participating in the dynamic. And here is where the Stoic principle comes in fully. You do not need to control them. You only need to control your standards, your responses, and your energy. That leads us to the final point, the anchor that holds everything together. Number 10. The Stoic principle, control yourself, not them. At the end of all of this, there is one idea that holds everything together. A principle so simple that most people overlook it, yet so powerful that once you truly live by it, many toxic dynamics simply lose their grip on you. You stop trying to control other people, and you start controlling yourself. Most people spend enormous energy trying to influence how others behave. They try to convince someone to respect them. They try to argue someone into understanding them. They try to make someone feel guilty enough to change their behavior. But the Stoics understood something that modern life constantly distracts us from. Other people are not within your control. Their personality, their character, their habits, their intentions, all of that belongs to them. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this constantly. When someone behaved poorly, he didn't waste energy trying to reshape their character in the moment. Instead, he asked a much more powerful question. What part of this situation belongs to me? And the answer was always the same. Your response, your standards, your self-respect, your discipline. Once you internalize this, the entire game changes. You no longer try to force respect through confrontation. You no longer chase validation from people who enjoy withholding it. You no longer feel responsible for correcting someone else's behavior. Instead, you quietly adjust what you allow. You adjust the conversations you participate in. You adjust the attention you give. You adjust the access people have to your time, your emotions, and your presence. And the strange thing is, once you do this consistently, many toxic interactions simply stop happening. Not because the other person became enlightened, not because you delivered the perfect speech, but because the conditions that once allowed the behavior have disappeared. A toxic person cannot play a game if the other player refuses to enter the arena. This is why Stoicism places so much emphasis on self-mastery, not as a philosophical concept, but as a practical skill. The more stable your inner world becomes, the less influence other people's behavior has over your peace. Epictetus said something that perfectly captures this idea. No one has power over you unless you grant it to them. And granting that power often happens in subtle ways. When you allow someone's disrespect to control your emotions. When you feel the need to explain yourself endlessly. When you chase approval from someone who has already shown you their character. But when you reclaim control of your responses, something shifts. You move through conversations differently. You respond with calm instead of urgency. You withdraw your energy when respect disappears. And over time, the people around you adjust to the new reality. Some will rise to meet your standards. Others will slowly drift away when they realize the old dynamics no longer work. Either way, your peace becomes protected. And that is the real goal. Not winning every interaction, not forcing every person to respect you, but building a life where your inner stability is not constantly negotiated by the behavior of others. So remember this: the day you stop explaining yourself to those who measure your tolerance, the day you stop reacting to every small provocation, the day you become selective with your energy and steady in your responses, is the day toxic people begin to lose their influence over you. Because the world does not just respond to what you say, it responds to what you consistently allow. And once your standards become clear through your behavior, not just your words, disrespect simply stops finding space in your life.